telling everybody about.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Patti, thank you especially for joining us today. I will just kick this off by reading a very short bio so that everybody kind of gets a little bit of at least your online biography, and then we can hear from you, of course. Patti Callahan Henry is a New York Times, Globe and Mail, and US Today bestselling author of 17 novels, including her newest, The Secret Book of Flora Lee. She's also a podcast host of the original content for her novels, Surviving Savannah and Becoming Mrs. Lewis. She's a recipient of the Christie Award, Book of the Year, the Harper Lee Distinguished Writer of the Year, and the Alabama Library Association Book of the Year for Becoming Mrs. Lewis. She's the co-host and co-creator of the popular weekly online Friends and Fiction Live web show and podcast. You also contribute to monthly life lesson essay column for Parade magazine. She's published in numerous anthologies, articles, and short story collections, including an Audible original about Florence Nightingale titled Wild Swan, narrated by Tony Award winner Cynthia Erivo. A full-time author, mother of 3, and grandmother of 2, which is very hard to believe.
Oh, I like that.
She lives in Mountain Brook, Alabama, with her husband, Pat. Welcome.
Thank you. It's always so weird to hear somebody read. It makes me want to go back into your website and redo your bio. Patti is an author, period. Like, that's it.
That's
Patti writes
books.
The end.
But like those are the little tidbits I know you won't tell us yourself. So it's good to preemptively hear all the accomplishments. I don't even know if we would have got out of you that you have written that many books, actually.
I always, when I hear it said out loud, like anything, it was one at a time.
Yeah.
So if 25 years ago, somebody would have said, and on your 17th novel, I would have been like, I don't have that many ideas. Are you crazy? Like, you have an idea at a time. I don't have some kind of like spreadsheet of ideas and start writing them, So it's like kids. Then another one shows up, and then another one, and then another one. So there you go.
For those who have joined us, please feel free to either raise your hand and ask your question live. That's always best case scenario, but you're also welcome to just pop it in the chat and I will make sure that it gets asked. But to kick off, Patti, before we get into anything else, I would just love to know sort of like your take on how this career of writing and being a published author, because you can set out to be a writer, but that doesn't mean you're going to be a published author. So if you can just give us a little background into how that all came to be, that would be wonderful.
Oh, wow. I hardly get asked that. And it's such fun to talk about because I think there's this misrepresented idea that to be a published author, you need to know a bunch of people, or you have to have an MFA, or you took literature in college. So the only credential I had when I first started writing is that I've been an avid reader my entire life. So I grew up as an avid reader. If we were live, I would make you raise your hand. How many of you got in trouble for reading when you were young? That was me. Get your head out of the clouds. Thank you. And so I was obsessed with language when I went to high school. I moved around a lot. And when I went to high school, I took Latin instead of a language that I could speak on vacation. But because I was obsessed with language, but also because really the only thing I wanted to be was a nurse. So I graduated from high school. I went to Auburn University. I went to nursing school. I got my master's degree in pediatric nursing. I was a clinical nurse specialist. And all this time I'm reading, I'm scribbling, I'm reading. And to me, the authors were the pictures on the flaps of books. To me, the books were the living things, not the authors, until I decided I wanted to try it. And I think we talk about in novels, the inciting incident, like what is the thing in a novel that gets the novel going, right? That's kind of the first thing you learn when you're writing the inciting incident. All these other things might have happened, but then there's this one thing that sets it off. And for me, in a life story way, I was playing dollhouse with my 5-year-old daughter when I asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up. And she said she wanted to be a writer of books. She didn't say she wanted to be a New York Times bestseller. She didn't say she wanted to be, a author. She said, I want to be a writer of books. And I knew why she said it. She said it because I read to her nonstop. And it was the only time we were alone because she had two little brothers. I had three kids under 5. I don't know what I was thinking. I wasn't, but anyway. So there was like this thing meant so much to her. And I said, well, that's what I want to be when I grow up. And she said, well, you're already grown up. And the next day I signed up for writing classes because I realized and knew that all the other things I had done had led to that. Like if I looked back at the stepping stones, reading, libraries, taking Latin, being obsessed with mythology, it was leading to this. I just wanted to write one book. And so that was 17 books ago, but I took writing classes at Emory. It was years. I mean, it was years. I treated it the same way I treated a master's degree. I joined writing groups, but to answer how did I first get published? It was years ago. So my first book came out in 2004. So it was bought in about 2002. This is way before people even really used email that much. You would print the book, put it in a box, mail it to New York. I entered a contest and I won the contest and I got my first agent. And that's how it all started. Now, that book was not my first book. I had to sit down and write a second book, but I didn't know what I was getting into. I dove in the deep end. I did not know a single author. And now my life revolves, if you know Friends in Fiction or you've seen my life on Instagram, my life mostly, except for family and best friends, revolves around the literary world. When I travel, it's for that. When I am on doing events, it's for that. And 25 years ago, I didn't know a single author, not a magazine writer, not a newspaper writer, nothing. So I jumped in the deep end, and what is the saying, jump and the net will appear. Sometimes it wasn't there and I fell, but it's what I did.
That sounds like a great story because I think even like in 2002, I feel like it was probably harder to get published. There's like a lot of resources now for people looking for ways to
There were
get.
no resources, nothing
Yeah.
online. I mean,
Yeah.
I went to the library and saw one of those little things that you pull, like a writers group in town. I went to that. I went to I went to the night classes at Emory, and there I met people who told me about writing groups and things like that. So yeah, now you can say best writing groups in my area on Google and they'll pop up.
Yeah.
So I've never been as determined as I was to get published. Never, not in anything in my life was I as determined.
That's great. Just to reiterate, anybody, if you'd like to ask a question live, then you're more than welcome, but please pop your questions in the chat if you have them. I will use those that I have been emailed, which are very many.
I'm
Um,
here for it. I won't make the other answers that long, I promise.
No, that's fine. You're good. So we're here to talk about The Secret Book of Flora Lee, which is the novel that we all read in the last month. And I actually just had my own book club last night. So it's all fresh in my mind and we discussed.
Oh, that's so fun. In Bali? You had your book club in Bali?
I had my book club in Bali, yes.
And they read Flora Lee. That makes me so happy.
We had
Fantastic.
a few little hiccups for accessibility, but we got there in the end. We
That's
shared.
awesome.
So the story of Flora Lee weaves together history, family, and the power of storytelling. What inspired you to write The Secret Book of Flora Lee, and how did the idea evolve?
So where do ideas come from is one of my favorite subjects. When I'm interviewing another author, it's always the first question I ask. And I'm here right now, I'm in South Carolina right now with one of my dearest writing pals, Paula McLean, who wrote The Pear's Wife. But we are constantly talking about where do ideas come from? Because you want to make sure they keep coming, right? Is there like a box you open up? And we always come back to the same thing. It's about staying curious and open. And so when I'm curious about something, I know there's probably a book idea in there. And what happened with Flora Lee is I can point to the exact moment the story was born as a tiny little seed. And it's when I was doing research for another novel I wrote called Once Upon a Wardrobe. And in Once Upon a Wardrobe, part of the novel is about the 7 events in C.S. Lewis's life that led to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And one of those events is when children came to live with him and his brother during World War II. And I knew that because that's where Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy come from. But what I didn't know was that it was called Operation Pied Piper. And being this great lover of myth and legend, I thought to myself, I don't think that's a very good legend. And I looked it up, and sure enough, it's not. It is the story of a piper who plays a flute and leads children to their deaths. And they disappear forever in the River Wyvern. And I immediately imagined two little girls, sisters, who are sent away during Operation Pied Piper, and one disappears by the river. So that was the very first seed of the novel. And obviously other seeds grew into it, but that was the very first impetus of why would the British government name an operation to keep children safe after a German legend, it's World War II, of disappeared and drowned children? What the hell? That's where it started.
Good question.
I know, right? Nobody's answered it for me yet. Nobody. So, yeah.
So the novel, like you were just discussing, is set against the backdrop of World War II and the evacuation of the children from London. And we know what drew you to the historical moment now, but how did you do your research? And how did you research the emotional and historical complexities of this time?
It seems like you've done interviews before. That is such a good question. So, and that's two separate things, right? Like, how did I do my historical research, but the emotional complexities? That is such a great question, because Pied Piper itself is just reading the history books, right? Over 750,000 children were evacuated in 4 days. It was one of the most successful operations, or schemes, as the Brits call it, operations of the war. It involved 100,000 teachers and almost 1 million children. In 4 days, they were evacuated from large cities, sent away on trains, sent away on buses, sent away to strangers. Every child carried the same thing: a knapsack, a gas mask, and a luggage tag around their neck that said where they were from, but not where they were going, because they didn't know where they were going. They all went to these cities and towns and were sit in town halls while people walked around and said, "I choose you. I choose you. I choose you." Terrible. And if there were children left at the end of the day, they went door to door and gave them away. And parents sent them to this, right? So that's the historical facts of Operation Pied Piper. But then there's the emotional part of Operation Pied Piper. And that is where I turn to first person accounts, what we would call in the research word primary sources. I interviewed a woman, she was 91, who had been an Operation Pied Piper child. I read all these first person recorded accounts and also written accounts. A lot of these people didn't talk about it until the last 10 years. So some books have come out, one of the most profound being a book called Don't Forget to Write. And it is a story of all these people who remember that that was like the last thing the parents said, because they sent you with a postcard and you had to write on the postcard where you ended up and where you were living, because even the parents didn't know where you were going. Don't forget to write. But the woman I interviewed in London, I went to London for a research trip. I visited everywhere you read about in the novel. I visited. There's nowhere you read about that I did not put my feet on the ground. And I went to visit this woman outside of London, and she told me her whole story, how it felt. She went with her brother, how her mom eventually came and got her, and they moved to Penzance. And I said, when you were reunited with your mom and your brother, because then her and her brother got separated, did you talk about it? Not one time, she said. Not once. She said they never talked about it. And she said, that's weird, right? And I was like, I'm an American, I'm zipping it. I'm not telling you what's weird and what's not. But yeah, the emotional part of what these children went through and parents was something. And this book is written in World War II. That part, we go back and forth in time, but the 1940 part is written from a child's point of view. So I'm giving you something much different than what we usually read about 1939 and 1940. I'm giving you the behind the eyes of a young child sent away and living in the country.
We have a comment from Jody, and it's not a question, but she wanted to comment that she sure thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. It was so intriguing, and it was one of those books that for her, she couldn't wait until she had time to read more.
Jody, thank you. That means a lot to me. It's how I felt when I was writing it. I mean, honestly, I have another writer pal who believes that every other book tears you apart and is really hard, and every other book is one you can't wait to get to every other day. And I was like, oh, this is the one I couldn't wait to get to every day. I loved writing this book.
Having said that, I've heard from other authors that when they finish, there's a little bit like of sadness that you have to say goodbye to the characters. Is that real for you?
What a great question. It's very true, and this is embarrassing to admit, but after I finish a book and it's time to write another one, I'm always like, is there a sequel in there? Like, I think there's probably a sequel in here. Does Bridie need her own story? Should I write a children's book? Like, I usually spend a month or two wondering if there's a way to extend it. When
Right.
I knew when I wrote it that it was never meant to be a series or a sequel, right? I knew when I wrote it that that's what I wasn't doing, but I'd spent an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out if there was a way to extend this with these characters, 100%.
Do you have series? Any books that are series?
No. The way that I write, I actually would love to write a series. I think it'd be really fun. I'd like to find one character that I carry through 3 or 4 or 5 books. I think that would be fantastic. But the way that I write, at least until now, has been a question comes to me or a what if, and then I answer it by the end of the book,
Mhm.
right? What happened to Flora Lee? What would happen if 2 sisters were sent away and one disappeared by the river? Like, that's how the book came to me. And I can't make that a different idea than what it is.
Yeah.
And so once that question is answered, unless there's a character spinoff, it doesn't come to me as a character who should be spread out on 3 or 4 books. But if
Right.
that happened, I would be really happy.
So you did just mention that they're sisters. So sisterhood is central to the book, especially the bond between Hazel and Flora. How did you develop the relationship, and what message did you hope that readers would take away from their journey?
I never go in with a message I hope anyone gets. Um, I don't write from theme. Like, I hope you all realize the power of story. So let me lecture you about the power of story. Um, I went in with this idea. What would an older sister do to keep a younger sister safe? How far would an older sister go to discover what happened to her little sister? And at 14 years old, 13 years old, what is the one thing she would do to calm her, which is where the fairy tale came from. Now, we only have our own compost pile to write from. So I do have a sister who's 11 years younger than me. I'm the oldest of 3 girls. And I have a sister who's a year and a half younger, but then I have one who is much younger. So did that feed into it? I don't know. I never had to take care of her. I left home when she was probably 5, went off to college. But what if that was my job, right? And that's where the fairy tale came from. 'Cause I thought that's what I would do. I would make up a fairy tale world to kind of keep us sheltered and safe. Um, so I wasn't trying to how these 2 would handle something like this. And putting myself in the minds and hearts of a child who's been exiled from their parents. Can you imagine? So your older sister is no longer your older sister. It's the only person left of your family. And your younger sister is no longer just a little girl. She's your responsibility. Even if the woman you moved in with is wonderful, she's still yours. And I can't imagine being exiled from my family in that way, knowing there's bombs dropping. So that's what I spent my time thinking about.
Um,
Did I lose you?
no, you didn't.
Oh, okay. I'm like, oh no, it
I'm
went
here.
quiet.
I think my Wi-Fi is doing something weird. So going back to the idea of Whisperwood, how was that to make up for you?
Whisperwood was so much fun. I'm going to write a children's book. Just you wait. I just haven't had time. I've been touring for Flora nonstop, and I have a book coming out in March. But um, I so I grew up, my bread and butter of fantasy world was Narnia, right? I think anybody who's my age probably grew up the same way, right? In the 60s and 70s and 80s. And so I used to wander around and pretend that I could find a portal to another world, that there was a secret door. And in that land, I am a queen or a princess. And as I got to, as a older woman, create that world for my characters, I had the best time. And it's the very first scene I ever wrote for this novel. I sat down and it's the scene, I think it's chapter 3 in this novel, where Hazel makes up Whisperwood for her sister, and she's making it up on the fly. Okay, I see a shimmering door. We're stepping through it. It's a place where we can be anything we want to be. And while Hazel was making it up, I was making it up. Hazel and I were making that up on the fly. Like we were creating this world and got to create it even more so as the book went on. Well, what else is there? There's a river that sparkles with stars. What else is there? There's a castle far off. You've got to try and get to it. What do you do there? You can be anything you want to be. Anything. A bird, a chipmunk, a squirrel, anything you want to be, you can be in that world. And so as Hazel's making it up for Flora Lee, I'm making it up. And I absolutely loved doing that. In fact, I didn't put near as much as I wanted to in the novel because that wasn't the story. The story was what happened to her. And so I actually had to kind of like pull the reins back on Whisperwood.
The next question I have is actually an interesting one because we get complaints all the time that our stories are too dark, or like we always reading about death. And so I'm always like, when I'm first initially sort of like drawing up this short list of books that we're going to vote on, I'm always like very concerned about people dying or
Oh gosh, yeah.
so like missing children, obviously. But having read your book earlier on, we decided to put it in because even though your characters carry so much emotional depth, especially as they're wrestling with these extreme losses, but they have so much hope as well. And I wanted to know how you managed to balance the emotional weight of the story, like this World War II backdrop, while keeping it engaging and uplifting even for readers.
Oh, that's a great question because I'll give you a story. To answer your question, I'll give you a story. My daughter is 30 and has 2 little girls, and her oldest little girl is 5. And when she was reading it, now she's turning 6. And she called me in the middle of reading my book and said, you have to tell me whether she lives or dies, because I cannot read one more page if this girl dies. And I was like, as if I'm going to kill her. Like, it was never about that. The question was never, is she going to live or die? The question was always, where is she? Right? Like, I didn't want to write some dark, sinister child napper locked in the basement story, right? This was about the guilt that Hazel had because she believed that this fairy tale world she made up took her sister away from her, when really it was a person that took her sister away from her. And she needed to find that out to be able to open up her life again. But I think I didn't think that much about it because I don't write dark like that. Hi, cutie pie. I see you. You can't hide. So
Going to go to school.
have a good day at school. What grade are you in?
What grade are you in?
Charlotte.
It's called Starlings here. It's like
Okay.
kindergarten.
My granddaughters go to a Waldorf and they're called kinder Wound or something. Yeah, same thing. They don't call it like kindergarten or first grade.
That's right.
Um, but anyway, so I don't write dark, like that's not my natural inclination. So even if something hard is going on, I try to fill it with light and hope, but also be real about loss and all that kind of thing. So that's how I handled it. Knowing that there was hope, knowing that we'd solve it, knowing that a fairy tale had something to do with it. And also the setting is so beautiful. That brings a lot of hope too. I didn't put us in a dreary, bombed out shelter. I put us in the countryside of England. So did we lose her again?
Sure. Um, the novel alternates between the past and the present. Why did you choose this dual timeline structure, and how does it add layers to the overall narrative? And actually, I'd like to know, is it difficult to write like that?
So there's so many different ways to do dual timeline. And I feel like this one, I don't know if I mean, they call it that, so that's legit. But usually when I talk about dual timeline, I mean two different narrators, right? So I wrote a book called Surviving Savannah, which is a true dual timeline. We have 1838 and 2016. And it's about a lost to time shipwreck. And we're on that ship with women in 1838. And then we're with the woman who they have discovered, with a shipwreck hunter who has discovered the book in 2018. And they're tied together by a piece of artwork. So there's a tie between them, but it's a dual, like we are from two different women in two different timelines. With Flora Lee, Hazel is narrating this story until we meet Peggy and some other people, but Hazel is narrating the whole time. So we hear from the same person. So I think of it more as a time weave, I would call it, right? Like we're kind of weaving in between 1940, 1960, 1940, 1960, but with the same person, the same voice. And I didn't know how I would actually narrate this novel when I first started. I never do. I'm not a big outliner. So when I first started writing it, I was writing it straight shot, right? It's 1939, Operation Pied Piper goes into effect. They move to the country, they meet Bridie, she disappears, straight shot all the way to her finding the book in the bookshop 25 years later. And so when I finished working on it that way, I realized that this might be boring for non-writers, but I realized that the narrative drive came from her finding the book, right? She finds the book, she's in the bookshop, she knows that this story survived. This story that was a secret survived. And that had to set off the story. So then it became more of a time weave than it was in the way that I wrote it.
I like to hear that because obviously we read a lot of what they say called dual timelines. So it's interesting to see your unique perspective on that. Sorry, my daughter is absolutely screaming in the background.
It's fine if you need to tend to her. I'm sure all of us can talk.
Okay. Okay.
She's adorable.
Okay. So I will ask you a question and then I will deal with this.
Okay. You guys ask me a question so she can deal with her daughter. You guys throw some questions in the chat and we'll deal with it while you're playing with her.
Well, the novel is a blend of historical fiction, mystery, and magic realism, which is really interesting in itself because I when I started out, I didn't understand that there was going to be that sort of mystery element that I was really shocked about, actually, because it's like a whodunit almost until the very end.
Yeah.
So how is like sort of like mixing all those genres together? Is that easy? Is that just allow you like a lot of creativity, or how does that work?
I don't really think in terms of genre. I know I'm supposed to, right? Contemporary versus mystery versus magical realism versus I don't think in that way. I don't think, what genre am I writing in now? Romance, thriller. What I spend most of my time thinking about is, what is this story really about? So if you watch Friends in Fiction or have ever seen it, we interview other authors. And the first question we always ask is, what is your book about? And what is your book really about? And that's a different question than what genre is your book, or where do you think this falls in the literary landscape, or some kind of like heady definition of story. That's not as interesting to me as what is the book really about? And so that is what I spend my time thinking about. And for Flora Lee, yes, there's a mystery, but I probably wouldn't call it a mystery. Yes, there's a little magical realism built into the fairy tale. And yes, there's a romance because there's a love story. There's a couple of love stories. There's a love story between a mom and a daughter, two sisters, an old love and a new love. There's a love story between story and reality and logic. There's a love story with myth. There's so many love stories in it. But what the story is really about is the power of story, right? It is about the ability of story to shift the way we see the world and to shift the way we see ourselves. And so we humans, and the reason you're in a book club, we are a story making people. That is what we do in a conversation and in our lives. And the power of that, and when you take away that power, where you tell somebody your story harmed someone or you can't do it anymore. So I think more about those kinds of things than I do what the genre is. That's the publishing house's job. And it's so funny because when they listed it when it was coming out, they put it under historical fiction, which it is. It's set in 1940 and 1960. But I wouldn't have called it historical fiction, right? Because I would have called it fiction, right? General fiction or literature or something. So they need that. They need us to have it in these little pockets because that's the way it works and that's how they sell it. But for me, it's very much what the story is really about. I hope that makes sense.
No, and I feel like it makes so much sense. So I feel like I'm surprised I don't hear that more actually. That like so many
Yeah.
authors do pigeonhole themselves really into a genre because they're just supposed to write in that genre or they're comfortable in
Right.
it.
And so when I switched so my first 12 novels were contemporary. I
Mhm.
wrote contemporary fiction. They were set in the South, they were family dramas. And when I wrote a novel called Becoming Mrs. Lewis, everybody was like, oh, you're like breaking out of the box and taking a hard left. And I was like, no, I'm writing a story that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's it. Like, why does that have to be such a thing? Why are we making such a big deal of this? So.
That's true. It's a good question. I think this is a great segue to the next question. You've written numerous novels. How has your approach to writing changed over time? And how did this book challenge you in new ways?
Great question. I'm stealing all these questions when I interview other authors. My writing, the way I write has changed dramatically because I write historical, fact-based fiction now. So I am not a big outliner. I don't have a bullet point list outline. I don't break it down by chapters in a synopsis. But I also don't just fly by the seat of my pants. I spend a lot of time on timeline, historical, because you can't have them talking about something that hasn't happened yet, that kind of thing. But what I do is spend a lot of time on what I call the groundwork. I spent a lot of pre-writing time, number one, with research and reading, but also with what the story is really about and also what my character wants and why they want it. Because anytime I've ever been stuck in writing and anytime I didn't like my contemporary novels, it's because the character and what they wanted was vague. If you have a vague want, you have a vague story. So I spend a lot of time. What do they want? Why do they want it? Why can't they get what they want? What would they do to get what they want? Would they steal from their employer? Would they lie to their boyfriend? All these things that Hazel did, right? Like, how far would they go to get what they want? And the story grows out of that. So once I feel like I really understand that, for example, I have Hazel working in a antiquarian bookshop, and it was for a very specific reason. I just didn't pick something for fun. The reason I chose that is because Hazel is a shadow artist, meaning she is completely surrounding herself with the things that she loves that she refuses to do. So she works in an antiquarian bookshop. She collects antique pens and inkwells. She collects empty notebooks. She sits in writers' cafes and listens to writers, and yet she won't allow herself to write. So I need to know that about her before I even give her a job, right? So I spend my time on those things before I write. And that's what's changed. I used to just sit down and fly by the seat of my pants and do tons and tons of edits. And now I spend a lot more time on the front end.
Hmm. And having written all those books, do you have a favorite?
That I've written,
Yeah.
it's always the one coming out or the one I'm talking about.
Yeah, that makes
Um,
sense.
yeah, I mean, I love each book for a different reason. I love Becoming Mrs. Lewis because it changed my career and my life. I love The Secret Book of Flora Lee because it has all my favorite things in it, and I wrote it in secret and changed publishing houses with it. Um, I love the book coming out in March because it grew out of my great love of language. It's called The Story She Left Behind, and it's another kind of mystery. But it was inspired by a true lost to time cold case mystery of a child prodigy author who wrote a children's fantasy novel when she was 8 years old and disappeared when she was 26. So I'm so excited for it to be out and to start talking about it. But they all have a very special place in my heart. But The Secret Book of Flora Lee is probably the closest to the things I care about the most.
Okay. And what does this is always a fascinating question. It's probably my favorite question is, what does your sort of like process look like? Like when you wake up, do you write for 5 hours? Are there like months where that's all you do is write, or are you writing every day? Sort of what does that look like?
So when I first started writing, my kids were 5, 3, and newborn.
Oh my goodness.
So I know. So I wrote from 4:30 to 6:30 in the morning. I don't do that anymore,
Mhm.
but it got me in the habit of morning sacred time. So
Mhm.
yes, it's when I'm working. I mean, I'm always working, but when I'm writing or drafting a new novel, I write first thing in the morning.
Mhm.
I know I should work out first thing in the morning, but I write first thing in the morning. And I try to keep my morning sacred and clear for that work, for that drafting. I try to save the business or the book clubs or the emails or like I try to save all of that for sometime after lunch.
Right.
So even if I only write a paragraph or if I write thousands of words, or if I'm doing research or if I'm editing, I try to keep my morning for just that. I don't have any rituals. Like I don't have to light a certain candle or listen to a certain kind of music or be in a certain kind of room with a certain kind of, scent. I'm not precious about my writing in that way. I'm a workaday writer. I get up, I go to my office, I have a cup of coffee, and I try to write a story.
Yeah. And you just told us about the book that is coming out. And are you writing a new book, or are you still like in edit or?
No, I'm in copy edits and I am starting something new and I'm playing with it,
Yeah.
right? Trying to figure out what it's really about, who is my character. And I have about 5 or 6 months to play with that before I'm on the road for the new book. So I'm trying to use that time wisely, but also pre-pub stuff is kind of intense. Like I have to write essays on the road for the publishing house, doing media lunches and library, but like doing stuff like that. So to be pulled between the two is hard sometimes, but I don't want to waste these months where I can start to dive into something new so that when I get off the road, it's kind of waiting for me, like a little gift to dive back into.
For sure. Okay. Just leave us with a couple book recommendations that you either loved or you've read recently or
Absolutely. First, I see Sheila asked if I'm satisfied with the ending. It wasn't the original ending.
oh,
So I originally had a different ending. So I love the ending I have now. And thank you for saying it was a great book. But when I realized that the ending should be what it is now, it was exactly what I needed because a lot of the theme of this novel is who am I? Who am I?
mhm.
And that was what Dot was trying to ask the whole time. Some really good book recommendations. All right. One of my favorite books of the year was The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon. Don't know if you've read it yet.
Read
Absolutely
it.
loved it. Couldn't put it down. She's a dear friend, and I know what went into that novel, years and years of research, but you wouldn't know it because it is just a page-turning mystery. And I've been an evangelist for that novel. I just finished Jodi Picoult's new one, By Any Other Name, and I really loved it. I thought it was really great. I just finished Laura Dave's new one, the Laura Dave new one. It has a similar title to the last thing he told me, but it's a different title. The Last Night We Saw Him, or something like that. But I really liked it. It was a great, it echoed of her other novel, and I really, really liked it. What else did I like? I mean, I'm reading so many at the same time, because of the show, and those are my three favorites at the present.
The Night We Lost Him.
The Night We Lost Him. Thank you.
I put all those.
I really loved it. It's a quick read. It's really great. I've read a couple books for Blur, but I don't want to suggest them yet because they don't come out until like middle or late of next year. I love the new William Kent Kruger.
Oh, he's great.
Spirit Crossing, I think it's called. I think anything he writes is so heartfelt and page turning and wonderful. I just think he's one of the best. Christy Woodson Harvey's summer book, A Happier Life, is a great, sweet beach read. It's real. It's a sweet, fun story of family. Yeah, that's good enough. I think I just
Sorry,
loaded
tell me
you
that
down.
last one again.
A Happier Life by Christy Woodson Harvey, and Spirit Crossing by William Kent Kruger. Lorraine, if I could lobby for my book to be a movie, I would. I told my film agent and my movie agent the other day. I mean, my film agent and my literary agent the other day. I'm like, when are we going to crack this nut? Can we please? Like, we get so close all the time. So I will let you guys know as soon as that
The
happens.
books are optioned by play people, and then you don't get all the way.
No, I get. Here's the thing, historical fiction is really hard to be optioned. That's not what's playing right now. Rom-coms, but things sway, they move. You never know. I believe. Listen, I always say my job is to write books, and if one turns into a movie, I'll be over the moon. But I'm just going to keep doing my job, and then if one happens, it happens. And I believe it will. It just depends which one. So.
Well, thank you so much for your time tonight. And we really appreciate all the effort that went into writing your amazing book. And we can't wait to see what comes out next.
Well, I am so happy to have met and found the Gloss Book Club. I'm joining, and I think it's fantastic. And so thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a good evening.
Good night, everyone.